Time to add some moldings to our custom arch-shaped doorway. I have 3 files open on screen here. I have 2 profile families and a version of my door family. So I'm going to start with the Ovolo with fillet. These files are provided with the exercise files, and this is a copy of the Ovolo profile that we created earlier in the course, but I've added one detail to it. You can see here that I've added a reference plane that is slightly higher than the top reference plane here, and I've added a dimension that I called fillet, and it's currently set to 0.15. Now, in addition to that, I've made this whole thing flexible using the variable proportion methods that we talked about in the previous chapter. So if I go to family types, let me just kind of remind you of that. We, of course, have the R and the HD and the depth and the angle and the D and so forth, all being controlled with the trigonomic formulas to control the curve. I've moved Y and X and depth actually up here under constraints because they're all grayed out now because they're also being controlled by formulas right here. So each one of these is a multiplier that combines the scale factor parameter and some sort of a multiplier. So if we look down here under construction, I have all my multipliers. So I have an X multiplier, a Y multiplier, a fillet, and a depth multiplier. And then finally, I have a single scale factor, which drives the whole thing. So by changing the value of the scale factor, it will ultimately affect every single one of these parameters and overall resize the entire family. So if I just try 0.5 here and I click apply, you can see the whole thing gets half as big. So this scale factor, you can put in any number you want. It'll keep the same proportions, but it will resize things. Now, getting back to the fillet, that's just a straight segment of the molding. If I want that fillet to be a little bit larger, then what I can do is just increase the multiplier. So suppose I put in 0.5 for the fillet mult. Click apply, and you can see that that increases that without affecting the proportion of the rest of the family. So that's really why we've got these 2 sets of parameters here, the scale factor and the multipliers. And again, you can review the lessons in the previous chapter if you want to learn a little bit more about the strategy behind that. So there's really nothing for me to do with this family. This one's done already, so I'm simply going to load it into the door moldings family. And then I'm going to click over here to the Kaima with fillet, which actually doesn't have a fillet yet, and we're going to add that fillet in here. So you've seen the strategy in the Ovolo. Let's actually put it to work right here. So I want to add a fillet up in the top portion. So let me start by taking these dimensions and just sort of drag them out of the way a little bit. Give myself a little bit of room to work here. Okay, you can just sort of drag those anywhere you like. I'm going to add a reference plane across the top here. There's nothing special about 0.15 in terms of a dimension, but I'm just going to use that again just to be consistent. And then what I want to do is put a dimension here and label that. So I'm going to label that with a new parameter that I'm going to call fillet. And that's going to go under constraints because ultimately it's going to be controlled by a formula. Now, I need to assign my geometry to that reference plane. If I just try and move this line, it'll try and stretch the arc because currently they're connected at this endpoint. So it's very important that you do this next step. Select this line and using this grip here, just kind of disconnect at that end. Okay. Once you do that, now you can do align and select this. It will warn you that your constraints are not satisfied. That's because it's currently locked to this reference plane. It can't stay locked to that anymore. So we're going to remove those constraints and then add a new constraint by locking right here. I'll go to create, add a line from here to here, cancel, align and lock it to the vertical, and then finally use trim and extend to a corner to close that shape back up. And that should remove all of the automatic sketch dimensions. So the profile geometry is done. I've got the fillet parameter, but at the moment the fillet parameter is not being driven by anything in the family. So it's just its own little setting that's completely independent. I want it to behave like the fillet in the Ovolo family that I just showed you. So to do that, I'm going to go to family types and I need to create another parameter. So you can see here, if I scroll down, that I already have the scale factor parameter, and I already have the multipliers for X, Y, and depth. I need to add a new multiplier for the fillet that we just created. So I'll call that fillet mult. I just use mult because to abbreviate, but you can write out the word multiplier if you prefer. Remember, this is a number because it's a multiplier, so it has to just be a number with no units. It wants to put it under other, but I'm going to put it under construction to just match the other parameters that I've already created so that it'll go in that same grouping. The grouping is really up to you. It'll start off being 0. I'm going to make it 0.15 so it matches my current fillet. And then I just simply need to type in my formula here, scale factor times fillet mult. When I enter that, it will gray that value out as it applies that filter. So now this parameter that we created a few minutes ago is no longer independent. It's being driven by these other two values. So now the scale factor controls the whole family. And once again, if I do 0.5 and I click apply, you'll see the entire thing flex. Go back to 1, click apply, and it flexes back again. So I'll click OK here, and I'll load this into my project. Again, the door moldings project, and I'll click OK. And now we're ready to begin using those two molding profiles to create our actual molding geometry back in our door family. And that will be the subject of our next movie.